Welcome to the Healing Trauma Podcast, a space for those who are healing from complex and developmental trauma. Introducing your host, Monique Coven, a certified trauma recovery coach, survivor, and thriver. The intent of the podcast is to provide helpful information with insight that can validate, encourage, and support you on your healing journey. You're going to hear stories from other survivors and trauma experts, featuring therapists, coaches, and practitioners. We will open up the conversation on effective trauma healing modalities, practices, and tools. If you are interested in trauma recovery coaching, as well as recommended books and healing resources, head over to www.thehealingtraumapodcast.com. And now, here is your host, Monique Coven.
Welcome back, everyone. So before I introduce our guest today, I just wanted to say something about somatic healing. And so on this podcast, I try to bring in stuff that's going to be helpful for you on your healing journey, different modalities that can be useful, that can support you on your healing journey. And I love somatic work because I think for those of us who have been on this journey for a long time, the emphasis in the past has been very much on the thinking part of the brain and on resolving trauma. If we could just think our way through it, if we could have more clarity and more understanding, we could sort of reframe what happened. If we could just talk about it, we could make peace with it. But what we found was that didn't help our bodily responses. We still felt like we were, in a sense, still in the trauma, even though we had talked about it. We had talked until we were perhaps, re-traumatizing ourselves at times without any changes. Somatic work helps us to work on what is going on in the body. And I've heard people say in the past, trauma gets stuck in the body. And I used to think, what the heck does that mean? And so we're going to explore a little bit of that today. But trauma shows up in our body, often in terms of our patterns, our bodily defenses, the hypervigilance that was often learned very young through repetitive experiences or traumatic experiences. And one of the ways that that can be resolved or at least softened is through somatic work and somatic healing. So today's guest I've invited is Joshua Sylvae. And Joshua has been involved in the field of somatics since 2003. His study of nervous system regulation has incorporated inquiry into many fields, including ecology, philosophy, neurobiology. He holds an MA in clinical psychology with an emphasis on somatic psychology, a PhD in higher learning and social change, and he's a licensed marriage and family therapist. Joshua's clinical practice is grounded in somatic experiencing, and he also integrates psychodynamic perspectives, mindfulness approaches, a systemic orientation. He's a faculty member at the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, leading the Somatic Experiencing professional training in locations around the world. He's also legacy faculty for Peter Levine's Ergos Institute for Somatic Education. So we're in really good hands here, and I try to ask him questions that would help you understand a little bit more about somatic experiencing, because I know many people have questions like, what is it and how does it work and how do we resolve trauma, and what do you mean when you say completion? I remember that used to be a big question because I would hear, we need to resolve the trauma or complete the trauma, and I just wasn't hearing enough about what does that mean. So I asked him that question for you. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I certainly did. Hi, Joshua. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Monique. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about somatic experiencing. It's a very popular, it seems to have exploded lately. Everybody seems to know about somatic experiencing and how it can be so helpful with healing trauma, but not everybody. And so that's why I wanted you to come on here so that I could ask you some questions about why somatic experiencing in particular, but also somatic therapies. Why are they such an important part of healing trauma?
Yeah, shall I just go with that?
Yeah, that would be
Okay.
great.
So I know that we have, just half hour, 40 minutes or so. And sometimes I'll joke that it's harder to try to talk about this in a limited time format than it is to be able to, really have the time that I do with the 3-year SE professional training.
Mhm.
As we've discussed before we started our interview, it's a fairly complex body of work, and so I'll just be able to maybe touch on some pieces. One of the things that I think about in terms of somatic processes, somatic experiencing in particular, is that we integrate bottom-up processing into our approach. There are many approaches to health and wellness and healing that focus on more of a top-down inhibitory strategy. So we could take cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, which is recently as 10 years ago, the American Psychiatric Association was saying was the only empirically supported treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Though it can be very helpful to develop these top-down, often cognitively based or behavioral interventions to try to keep our nervous system from being too dysregulated. What we think is that it's more key in terms of the long-term resolution of traumatic impacts to also integrate bottom-up processing. So we're inviting, both in terms of our body and our mind, the bottom up of the body's information, the body's knowing coming into awareness, being a part of our process. And then also, I think in terms of the brain structure itself, looking at how important and how central the brainstem is for our experiencing and for creating, the platform on which all of our thinking and our feeling and our behavior rests. So if the brainstem and the brainstem in communication with the rest of the body is disorganized, we're pretty limited in terms of what we can think, what we can feel, how we can behave. And for sure, there's strategies we can employ, techniques, things that we can do to try to intentionally shift what's happening in terms of our thinking and all of that. But as Bessel van der Kolk said, Bessel is, of course, one of the leading lights in traumatology, and he can be kind of a cheeky guy sometimes, just likes to say it and get it out there. He said, if you're using cognitive behavioral therapy to treat trauma, you're treating the wrong part of the brain. There's the traumatic impact isn't stored in our neocortex, in that part of our brain that's involved in our complex strategic thinking and decision making. It's in the brainstem. It's in these more primitive brain areas that get disorganized. And so I really think that having interventions that target that level of our processing are going to be really key. So the somatic interventions, the sensory motor processing, really attending to the body and the movements that it makes, the ways that it expresses itself in terms of posture and gesture, facial expressions. All of this is so key for understanding the dynamics of trauma, because I think it's true that we can't just think our way out of trauma. We really do have to incorporate this bodily process, this brainstem process. So with somatic experiencing, it's kind of all right there in the name. Somatic means related to the body, and experiencing reflects present tense, here and now attention. So in a way, this is a kind of a mindfulness process where we're training attention to be in the here and now and aware of what's happening in terms of our body experience, as well as our thoughts and our emotions and mental images that might come through. But we really try to welcome all of that in and create a cohesive, coherent process that is helpful for transforming traumatic impacts and often leading people towards post-traumatic growth, or experiences that transmute trauma into, a fuller becoming.
Can you talk a bit about the brainstem? So you said that it gets disorganized. Can you elaborate a bit on that? When trauma happens, what's going on in the brainstem?
Well, the brainstem controls the autonomic nervous system, right? So in somatic experiencing and other somatic therapies, we'll look a lot at this part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. So it's a different branch of nervous system processing than the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system is traveling throughout the body, contacting all of our organs and glands, and creates for us a baseline level of arousal. And when our autonomic nervous system is regulated, when the brainstem is sending out the right signals and the afferent pathways are getting information about bodily state back to the brain in a coherent way, then our organism is designed to give us the optimal level of arousal to thrive in whatever our current environment is. So if our nervous system is regulated, it's going to be able to upregulate when I want to go play basketball or engage in some game with my kids. And then it's going to downregulate when I'm having a quiet interaction with somebody I care about. And then it's going to go into even lower levels of arousal when I'm trying to fall off to sleep or I'm sitting down on the meditation cushion. And so regulation for me is really all about behavioral flexibility, having this nervous system that supports me to really do well in whatever my current environment is, because my arousal is congruent with that. When our nervous system gets dysregulated, though, it's going to fail to do that. And that's what I mean by that disorganization, where brainstem and autonomic nervous system are not coordinated in a way where we're in that optimal arousal level. And the autonomic nervous system, the early anatomists called it autonomic because they saw how it was in some ways autonomous. We can use thoughts, use attentional processes to shift autonomic variables. So if I'm starting to feel stressed, I can take a breath and I can remind myself everything's going to be fine. And that might temporarily bring down my activation. We've all felt that delicious sense of relief when we're, getting stressed out about some inconsequential thing. And we remind ourselves like, okay, this isn't a big deal. And then we kind of go, okay, feels better. But what you might then experience is as your attention shifts to other things, that activation starts to creep back up. And then there we are 5 minutes later, on the hamster wheel in relation to that thing and being like, I got stressed out about it again. Darn it. It's not a big deal. And then we kind of, settle again, but then it starts to build back up. That's the way that this autonomic nervous system is autonomous can result in like lifelong dysregulation, where as a result of a traumatic birth or developmental challenges or traumatic experiences in early life or later, we start to exist within this dysregulation, and our nervous system is either functioning with the sympathetic branch of the autonomic, the excitatory branch, on all the time. So I feel stressed, and maybe that gets called this mood disorder of anxiety. But what's really going on is our organs and glands are functioning in a more intense way, conveying to us this sense of like, I feel stressed. Or sometimes a part of the parasympathetic nervous system comes on, and then we're just shut down. We're in some kind of collapse, and that may get labeled as a mood disorder called depression. But on this more fundamental biological level, it's this shutdown of the autonomic nervous system and brainstem sending out signals that keep us in a state of what's called energy conservation in biology. So yeah, we want everything to be integrated. We want our ideally, I believe, we want our neocortex to be parsing information and thinking through our experience in ways that support us to be in that optimal arousal state. We want the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, to be delivering to us a sense of emotion that allows us to integrate our experience, whatever it is. And then we want that brainstem to be feeding back to the body and taking in information from the body in a way that has our heart rate and our blood pressure and our respiration in that optimal arousal zone for our given experience.
Right. And most trauma survivors, like you were saying, about the activation, sympathetic, or the dorsal, or the like shutdown, from the repeated experiences. So I was thinking about, what about those people who have had from early on developmental trauma, where they were in experiences where their bodies went into overwhelm and all, and over and over and over and over again? How are they able to heal or begin to see some changes or more flexibility in their nervous system, so that so that it could respond a little bit more flexible? How would that work with somatic experiencing?
Well, we do use particular interventions to try to support this more bottom-up shift. We're going to be inviting people to come into connection with the environment through the senses. One of our primary interventions in the beginning, in terms of treating dysregulation, might be to really try to bring attention out into the external environment. So, whereas many people come to see me as a mental health professional expecting that our process is really going to focus on developing greater insight, I might think that the first step is instead to develop more outsight, to really begin to use our visual sense, our auditory sense, our tactile sense to connect to the environment and to begin to see what is actually around me. That really does seem to be stabilizing for the kind of animal that we are. And so that's certainly something that targets in that bottom-up way the autonomic nervous system. We will also begin to work with the patterns of attention when we are noticing our experience. So there's the external focus, and then as we go in towards our attention to our internal process, whether it is sensations in the body, thoughts, feelings, whatever it is, we're going to, in somatic experiencing, look for pendulation. So this is a term that Peter coined that has become fairly well disseminated, in the healing, in different healing approaches, especially in somatics. And the idea with pendulation is that our attention needs to be able to relatively easily move back and forth between what Peter called the trauma vortex and the counter vortex. So there are these poles that draw our attention towards them, and we could simplify this perhaps just in thinking about them as things that I don't like and things that I do like. There are experiences that we have of challenge and experiences that we have of something more towards pleasure, more towards comfort, more towards ease. And though it's not well understood in the general population, for healing trauma, it's really important to be able to move back and forth between those. And so, one of our initial points of emphasis in this SE process is to help people develop the capacity to attend to healthy, non-addictive pleasure. Things that actually feel good, that give me a sense of wholeness or of ease. Uh, Rather than diving into the trauma vortex and doing this extensive cataloging of what feels bad and what's not working, and joining with people in for what many folks is their already their superpower, which is paying attention to my distressing thoughts, my painful emotions, and my uncomfortable sensations. We actually at first try to help people to become aware of those aspects of experience that are pleasant, that give us a sense of ease and flow. So that also helps the nervous system to both to be more regulated, and then also to help us to move through and heal those traumatic experiences that we've had. There's a whole host of other things that we talk about in our training, different aspects of the work that are key. For sure, this paying attention to the body narrative and seeing, when the body is giving us information about what is incomplete, what might need to move through. That's somewhere where we will come in and bring our focus, help the organism to have a sense of being able to integrate experiences that previously had been too much for us. But yeah, you really kind of painted this compelling picture, where my early experience has been one of chronic stress. We would think that it actually would in some ways be adaptive to be in a state of heightened arousal in a fairly continuous way. When our environment is unpredictable, when there are threats that we've seen can arise, uh, with regularity and with in an unexpected way, to have a nervous system that is already in some sense in self-protection, again, whether that is the high sympathetic arousal of that we think of as stress, the kind of fight or flight response, or that shutdown response or freeze, you know, either of those might be more adaptive when we're in a chronically stressful environment. So I like to think here about how we might need to broaden our understanding of trauma. We've inherited from the psychiatric establishment this notion that what post-traumatic stress is an event. To qualify for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to meet the A criterion. And the A criterion says that you have had exposure to an event that involved exposure to actual or threatened death, sexual violation, or serious injury. So you have to have experienced this catastrophic event to qualify, for PTSD. That's been confusing for a lot of us trauma professionals who regularly see people who have the other symptoms of PTSD, but don't have that precipitating event. So I really think that broadening our understanding of trauma, really seeing it as the symptom of nervous system dysregulation rather than being associated with a particular event is key. Because I think our nervous system can get dysregulated in similar ways if we're experiencing chronic stress. Chronic stress due to developmental trauma, chronic stress due to what we'll sometimes call social and historical trauma, where the body that I am born into, the psyche that I have, my genetic inheritance, is labeled by my culture as somehow less than. The color of my skin, my sexual orientation, my gender identity, my disability status, any of these things can cause us to move through the world with a chronic sense of not being valued. And as we know, our nervous system is really built for feeling safe by being engaged with others.
Mm-hmm.
I say it, we're the most social animal on the planet, and in our in our evolutionary design, we spent time with others in incredibly intimate circumstances. So we really need that sense of being embedded within a coherent social group, I think, for our nervous system to function optimally. So it could be, developmental wounds, could be this experience of social or historical trauma. It could be intergenerational impacts. There's all kinds of different pathways, I think, to this nervous system dysregulation. And what's key is to be able to really support some kind of shift in terms of how the nervous system functions.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how when you were talking about just the impact of the dysregulation or living in chronic self-protection, when I think about the internal experience that I had after repeated over and over and over and over again, that overwhelm, no escape, and would want to, let's say, verbalize it or explain what it is. There's no words. There's no vocabulary. And that's why it's almost like you're pointing to your physiology. The way I used to describe it as a young person was it feels like it's like blood's moving up and down my vein. I didn't have words, but that's just it. It is a wordless experience.
I think of that as one of the beautiful things about kids, and this can be true if we have the honor of working with kids in a trauma healing approach. They're not as likely to need to make up a story about things. So when you were a kid, when I was a kid, and we were experiencing these moments of overwhelm, there could be the capacity of describing those as physiological experiences. What we often encounter in adults is a need to tell a story about why that's happening. And this, I think, if we're not integrating bottom up approaches, if we're not paying attention to the body as a sensing instrument conveying important wordless information to us, we're in danger of spinning yarns to ourselves, sometimes for decades. That the reason I feel this way right now is this, and the reason I feel this way right now is that. And I have deduced that the danger or threat is actually this person or this town or this job. And we kind of go on this quest to figure out, what's going on. While some of that, of course, is crucially important and necessary, insight is key. I think in SE, we talk about the different channels of experience and how they all have their place. They're all valuable, all welcome. Peter has a model that he describes in his books as SIBAM, and the SIBAM stands for sensation, image, behavior, affect, which is just another word for emotion, and meaning, which is related to thoughts. And in our work, we're really thinking about how do we support an integrated experience of these different channels. How do we have our sensations, our thoughts, our emotions, images, all of that how do we weave that, into a coherent, integrated experience? Our thing is called somatic experiencing, but I don't myself think necessarily that the sensation channel, or as it's technically called, interoception, is the healing agent, or is even necessarily more important. I think as we just said, having insight is really key. To be able to have a rich emotional life where I can process through what happens to me and discharge painful emotions and have access to an embodied experience of joy. Like that's also very important. But I think it's generally the case that it's the sensation channel, it's somatic experiencing, if you will, that is underrepresented in people's experience. And I will think of this sometimes as more than anything else, a cultural artifact. This is, especially in the modern Western world, but I think, one could make an argument that globally, this might be more true than it was in the past. We're a very disembodied culture. We have experienced this Cartesian split. We've entered into this dualism between mind and body and have begun to very much prioritize mental processing over direct, unmediated, embodied experiencing. And so we're focusing on somatic experiencing, not because it's better, not because it's truer or in some way, the ticket to liberation. It's because I think it tends to be offline for a lot of people. I've been teaching these courses in somatic experiencing for many years now. And at some point, I adopted a practice of, at some point in the training, I'll look out and I'll say, so who in this room, when you were a child, was regularly asked by your caregivers, what are you noticing in your body right now? And it's always crickets. I mean, there's never a hand that goes up. It's just remarkable. And I think that as you were kind of describing, when you were a child, there might have been this sense of like, you were feeling that cortisol dump. You were feeling that there was something happening in your embodied experience. But I'm going to wager a guess that there weren't adults around who helped you to understand that and make sense of it and be able to write it through and then notice as it starts to deactivate, and to practice orientation to your environment as a way to kind of work with the arousal. It's like, that's just, the body is at best, the seat of our most uh, uh, like antisocial impulses, and all of these things that have been labeled as bad or sinful, or you know and so we're all, I think, swimming upstream a little bit against this culture that has really pushed the body to the side and said, I don't think we can trust what's going on in terms of our tissues and our organs. And so we're kind of, I think, addressing some of that cultural baggage with our somatic emphasis.
I think one of the most common experiences and questions that survivors of trauma ask is, why do I still feel stuck when the past is over? Feeling stuck and overwhelmed is a very common experience. You don't have to do this alone. If you're interested in trauma recovery coaching, you can visit my website at www.thehealingtraumapodcast.com. Because trauma survivors have had to kind of almost move upstairs because things were so scary and so uncomfortable, they started living in their head. I think the first place really to start is to help people to come back downstairs and and get back in touch with the way that we were designed, which is fully human. I used to say it was like a head walking with legs. That's what I always used to say.
Yeah.
So coming back inside and, looking for those little glimmers that we can feel. You were mentioning the things that bring us a little bit of pleasure. What does that feel like? is amazing. And often with my own clients, it's like we're relearning what we missed out on,
hmm
you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's get fully human again. I love
Yes.
that.
Yeah, I do too.
One of my favorite things about somatic experiencing is on the back cover of Peter's first book, Waking the Tiger. He asks this question, and I truly believe this was one of the most important questions that was asked in the 20th century. He said, "Why do animals in the wild, though threatened routinely, rarely become traumatized?" A lot of Peter's early theorizing that became what we now call somatic experiencing was his study of the stress response and autonomic reactivity, and also his deep dive into ethology, the study of animals. And so he would watch, and the stories are that he would, somewhat obsessively catalog, these different nature videos and look at predator-prey dynamics. And he got really clear, and this is true, that people who study animals in the wild almost never report anything that looks like trauma. There's some isolated stuff, elephants, where poachers have taken their entire herd, and they're suddenly left alone. Uh, Sometimes particular like baboon troops develop really intense hierarchical rivalries, and you'll see particular individuals seeming to kind of decompensate. But for the most part, trauma doesn't seem to be a part of the natural order. And I think that's really worth reflecting on, that rather than some sort of thing that we should accept as a, I don't know, design flaw of the human organism, this propensity to trauma, I really think that we can start to see trauma again as a kind of cultural artifact. That in part, our disconnection from the body, our discomfort with involuntary bodily processes, like the shaking or crying or other physiological processes that can discharge that arousal for us. Um, and our need to control things that I think we've gotten from this particular way of living that we call civilization. Um, I think that it's those forces that are causing this propensity to a traumatic reaction. And so a lot of SE for me, doesn't necessarily land as, oh, we've developed this whole new thing. It's more like we've figured out how to help people, as you say, get human again and to shake off some of those accumulated influences and be able to see that the body is actually designed for trauma healing. Peter said that there's this intrinsic self-regulatory capacity within our organism, and that is often missed. So many approaches, even somatic approaches, will focus on the practitioner's intervention and see the trauma healing process as a strategic, technique-based, protocol-driven process. And though we will at times in SE have particular techniques that are important and that will pull out at the appropriate times, we're also really looking in a fundamental sense at how do we collaborate with the nervous system and with its essential strengths, with its intrinsic self-regulatory capacity. So that's what I oftentimes feel like I just have to say that's what really excites me about this whole thing. Is that we are involved in this larger process of recognizing how we might have gone off the path a little bit and what we need to bring in to realign ourselves with this, the beauty of the human organism.
And I'm also thinking, though, that trauma has been going on since the beginning of time, you know? And yeah, I don't know where we went wrong with not allowing us to, you know, do those responses that naturally happen. But that's what happened in society. We were told to stop it, cut it out,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
Mm.
yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, for whatever it's worth, I think it's maybe valuable to reflect on that phrase since the beginning of time. Our species has been around for over 200,000 years. The particular kind of organism that we are. If we look at other uh, Homo species, we could lengthen that out to say that, animals very much like us have been around for at least 1 million years. And it's only the last 10,000 years that we have begun to exist in time. Everything before that was prehistory, and then now all of a sudden we have history. And with that, the adoption of these very different ways of living on the planet, very different ways of being, which are called collectively civilization. And it's things like living in the same place all year round, uh, adopting agriculture, and animal husbandry. And some of those processes I think are telling, because it's a way of interacting with the environment where we try to control all of the different variables, and we kind of set ourselves up as the arbiter of which are the good plants and which are the bad plants. And we get rid of the bad plants and then do everything we can to throw lots of support behind the good plants, and we figure out which are the bad animals and which are the good animals, and get those bad animals out of here, and we'll put the good animals in our pens and take care of them. We'll create these structures where we try to keep the temperature constant, so we're living in what I'll sometimes call the false tropics, where it's just always a pleasant temperature. We're consistently trying to alter the variables of the world around us to control nature. And I think that unfortunately, that tendency has resulted also in a movement to control our own nature. Where we're beginning, not only in terms of the external world, but also our internal process, to disallow things that feel like they're not under our direct control. And that's where we get ourselves into hot water, I think. And maybe that's a big part of why, as we entered into time, as we entered into this way of life where we're trying to exert more and more and more control, we became vulnerable to trauma. It's just a hypothesis, but it's something that I think has been useful for some of my clients to reflect on. And certainly, learners in our programs, I think, can start to develop some greater understanding of how to work with individuals, as we maybe also understand our collective plight in a way.
yeah. I have one burning question before we end, and I think it's a really I'm very curious about it for you to explain it, and that is, what do you mean when it comes to healing trauma? What would you say about completion, the
Mm,
completion process?
mm.
Can you maybe give us an example of someone, or maybe just explain it?
Yeah, we talk about the renegotiation of trauma in SE, and I always say the um, the proof is in the pudding, as the phrase goes. Uh, I don't want to judge the efficacy of my work with people on what happens in the session. Sometimes I can do sessions with people that are very vivid and colorful and amazing, and all kinds of interesting things are happening in the body, and they're moving in these different ways, and it feels like, wow, this is incredible. This is going to be a before and after moment in this person's life. And then they leave, and maybe kind of starry-eyed, and we're both just feeling this sense of inspiration, and goodness. And then they come back the next week and it's like, it's gone. And I say, hey, how about that session last week, huh? And they kind of say, oh, yeah, that was interesting. God, last week was so hard. All of the same stuff is going on. My work is terrible and I'm not getting along with my partner. It like their life isn't changing. And so I really want to, as I'm working with people, be really aware of like what's actually going on in your life. How are things getting better? How is your relationship to your presenting complaint shifting? When you first came in, you said you were feeling a lot of anxiety. How's that going now? I think it's too easy to assume that because somebody has a powerful experience in our office, that the work has been a success. In terms of healing trauma, what I usually try to use as a metric is to ask somebody about their trauma. If we have done a good job of renegotiating something, they are going to notice that they hold that experience differently. For me, the name of the game is really integration. We've said that in SE, we're moving from a discharge model where the idea seemed to be that as long as you could discharge the energy, that would be liberation from trauma, to an integration model where it's clear that it's not just about the discharge. There needs to be some deeper process. Some people will explain this neurophysiologically as the consolidation of experiences that were too overwhelming for us and got stuck in our implicit memory or our procedural memory system, that getting consolidated into our autobiographical or narrative memory, the memory that we're aware of. It probably does involve that. Whether it's reducible to that, I don't know, but there's some process of integration. And often on the other side of that, you'll say, so maybe let's think about, to use a random example, this car accident. And they'll think about it and they'll realize, like, yeah, it feels different. I can think about this in my own experience. There were things that occurred in my life that when I would think about them subsequently, it would feel like it was happening again. My body would go into that same stress response. I would start to feel a quality of deep distaste or disgust, and there would be this sense of a big old stress response that started up. I might get triggered by things in my environment that reminded me of that event, and I would go into that stress response. It was like it was just waiting right there for me. And when it intruded into my awareness, it would feel like it was happening all over again. When I was later able to go through somatic experiencing sessions in which I renegotiated those traumas, I think about them now and it's not like that. And the thing that I'm often looking for is a person being able to describe their experience and their relationship to it in a way that's not overly colored by emotion, where I think about it and I start to go into, it's like it's happening all over again, and I'm feeling all of this intense stuff, and my voice starts to waver, and there's all of this emotion, or not enough emotion. It is true that there are ways of depotentiating triggers and modes of like neurolinguistic programming where we can end up completely disconnected from our experience. So I think about something and it's like it just doesn't impact me at all. That's not what we're looking for, I don't think. What usually stands out for me as the mark of trauma healed is a person being able to say something like the following: wow, as I think about that, I remember just how intense that was at the time. And that was really hard. Wow, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, but now that I'm on the other side of it, it's like I can really see that there were ways that I got stronger from that. And I definitely don't want to go through that again, but but it is something that happened to me. I don't know, something like that, where it's like I can connect with the feeling state of it, but I'm not swept up by that feeling state. Does that make sense?
It does, but I still wanted to know what you mean by renegotiation. Is there a way that you could explain it a little bit?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. Again, it's funny to think about putting this into a little nugget. But the idea of being able to renegotiate something, or the way that completion is a part of that renegotiation, it suggests that there's something unfinished in trauma. And we say that we have not been able to integrate the experience. There's something, the nervous system doesn't know time. The autonomic nervous system doesn't know time. And I think that there's a way in which, for the nervous system, when we haven't integrated our experience, it's like it's still happening. And there's often something that's incomplete. There's often a self-protective response that didn't get to happen. There's an emotion that wasn't able to be fully felt and processed through. There's like words that I wanted to speak. There's a way that I wanted to advocate for myself that I didn't do. Some part of me told me to run away really early on, but I didn't listen. Um, there's something that that hasn't been able to be fully felt, fully processed. And it's in completing those pieces, it's in giving ourselves, often with this supported environment of sessions where there's somebody there containing the experience and holding space, where I have the opportunity to move through those pieces that weren't able to finish. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I
Okay.
experienced that myself, and it's powerful.
Yes.
Thank you so much for talking with us. Is there anything else you want to add before we close that comes to your
Well,
mind?
not not so much. So just to for your listeners, just to name that I do teach the 3-year SE professional training. That's a training for professionals whose work brings you into contact with traumatized individuals. If you are one of those professionals, do look into the SE training if you're interested. And I also am, offering other workshops and things. So, I might just invite people to check out my website, which is my last name, Sylvae, SYLVAE.net. And then additionally, the way that we got connected, Monique, was through the Ergos Institute. Peter Levine, the originator of Somatic Experiencing, he has created the Ergos Institute of Somatic Education, which offers master classes for somatic experiencing practitioners who made it through that 3-year training. And then additionally is involved in a number of different community health efforts, where we're attempting to bring SE to places where it's needed. So, just encourage people to check out those different resources and to get connected, in whatever way is good for them.
Yes, I'll put them in the show notes for sure. All right,
Nice.
Joshua, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. It was fun. Thank you.